Good morning from Davos. Welcome to the third annual Human Rights LGBTQ Breakfast. It's great to see so many of you here in the room, and it's terrific to welcome those of you who are watching us on Facebook. It's cold here in Davos, but I can assure you we're having a good and interesting time, and a time, I think, for us to celebrate a lot here at the LGBT community. It's been really a milestone year in the sense that I've just learned that for the first time this year, there will actually be a discussion within the Congress Center, which is the kind of hallowed ground of the World Economic Forum. So a lot of progress and a huge amount of progress made around the world. 82% of the Fortune 500 companies now measure their progress on LGBTQ issues. A lot to celebrate. But at the same time, we've seen an enormous amount of change in the last year politically, particularly the populist backlash that we've seen on both sides of the Atlantic, which I think has given a lot of pause for thought. Does this mean a turning point at worst, or does it mean a more difficult environment for the broader human rights agenda and for particularly the LGBTQ community? So I wanted to discuss that with you all this morning, and a wonderful panel to discuss it with. Very brief introductions. On my right, for those of you who are watching, on your left, Zeid Ra'ad Al-Hussein, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Next to him, Susan Hauser, Microsoft's Head of Corporate External and Legal Affairs. Next to Susan, we have Ken Roth, the Human Rights Director, the Executive Director, forgive me, at Human Rights Watch. And finally, last but absolutely not least, Sander Nordende, the Group Chief Executive of Accenture. So welcome to all of you. And I want to start with that question. Give us a sense, and perhaps I'll start with you, Ken, because you follow this extremely closely. How much should we make of the political changes that we've seen in the last year and what they mean for the LGBTQ community?
Okay, well, obviously the big question is Trump. And, while I think Trump personally is committed to LGBT rights, he grew up in New York, he's, in that milieu. What everybody is worried about is that he has surrounded himself by social conservatives, and he's committed himself to appointing social conservatives to the US Supreme Court, which has really been the focus of much of the progress in the United States. Now, I don't see a retrenchment on, for example, marriage equality, but I am worried, first of all, about some of the unresolved issues about transgender rights, about so-called conversion therapy, which the Supreme Court keeps ducking. But the big issue in the United States is this concept of religious liberty. And does that concept give you a right to discriminate against LGBT people because you say it offends your religious convictions? Now, we would never say, my religious convictions say I get to discriminate against blacks, or I get to discriminate against women. But somehow this question is still in play with LGBT people. Mike Pence, the vice president, actually enacted a law in Indiana trying to do this and had to then step back under severe economic pressure. So there's going to be a fight in the United States. Now, it's important to recognize that the United States is different from even conservative movements in Europe. There's a much more religious complexion to conservatism in the US. In Europe, ironically, people who are the Trump equivalents, say Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen in France, actually use LGBT rights to pursue their anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim convictions. And so they say, if we let more Muslims in, it's going to jeopardize gay rights. And so that plays out very differently there. The real threat coming from Europe, I think, is Putin and his traditional family, traditional values approach, which he's used to enact this law against so-called homosexual propaganda against young people, which has really turned into just a license for violent attacks. So there is kind of a real mixture on the two sides of the Atlantic. And of course, the rest of the world, there are comparable differences and nuances as you go around.
Said, how would you see it, and particularly let's broaden it beyond the North Atlantic? How do you, if you had to kind of rate the political events of the last year and whether they've been good or bad, where would you come out, and where do you particularly worry about?
Well, Ken is absolutely right. In Northern Europe, the populist, or let's say the populists, have captured that ground. In Southern Europe, it's not so clear. When I was in Austria about a year ago, and I was meeting with the LGBTI community or LGBTQ community, they were concerned that the politics of exclusion propagated by the Freedom Party, by Norbert Hofer, was also putting pressure on their own community after years of progress. And one has to recall that over 25 years, 70 countries have decriminalized LGBT, or let's say LGB behavior. We still have some way to go on transgender and intersex, but we've seen tremendous progress. 50 countries have also taken measures against unfair practices against the LGBTQ community, and 30 countries have legalized same-sex marriage and partnerships, civil unions. So we against this backdrop, we have seen retrenchment, but we also should take notice of some positive developments. In 2013, the Indian Supreme Court upheld the colonial-era ban when it comes to criminalizing LGBT behavior. And the entertainment industry, the private sector, the media, put enormous attention, or gave enormous attention to the rights of LGBTQ, and sort of bucked the trend. And I think this is ideally what you want to see from the private sector, that even though the government takes, or let's say the courts take a position, you still have the private sector decide to do otherwise. And while the law was upheld, the LGBT community has been given unprecedented attention. And this is the sort of thing that I think you want to encourage.
Susan, that's where I wanted to bring you in, because it is interesting how the private sector reacts when the political environment shifts even a little bit. It's presumably easier to go with the flow when the flow is going in the right direction. How does a corporation react when the political environment changes? And perhaps with particular reference to the US, how are you thinking about this differently now?
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft has a deep commitment to anti-discrimination. Absolutely, there's no doubt that discrimination breaks up communities. It's bad for our employees. It's bad for business. It stifles innovation. And we have a set of principles in terms of standing behind our employees. We were very clear the day after the election that our principles had not changed. The day before, we had a set of principles in terms of supporting our employees and having very clear guidance in terms of what we stand for as a company. The day after, those principles did not change. What I will say is that we have found that we have communicated, almost over-communicated that, and giving employees an opportunity through our employee network groups to bring employees together, to have open dialogue, because the concerns, the fears are real. And so we need to acknowledge that they are real, but we stand behind our employees and continue to show that we are a company that, as a private sector, that we will continue to support our employees and our principles will not change.
Do you think you have, as a company, a greater responsibility to act now that the going might become tougher in some places?
Yeah, I think that our responsibility continues to educate and to continue to show that, that there are not only its human dignity, but it's also there are business drivers. And we both publicly make those statements in all countries in terms of the rights of our employees. And at the same time, we work very hard to also show countries that it is an imperative in terms of innovation. And that if you are not being open and allowing all employees to have human rights, that you're limiting yourself. And so we need to continue to drive that message. And I do think that it's even more important than ever for us from a private sector, not only to have that position, but also to join forces with other private sector companies to expand those connections in employee groups. And I know that we've often, with Accenture, as a matter of fact, we'll do joint events as well to ensure that they feel that there is more than just Microsoft, but it's a community. And more, we're investing in opportunities for our employees to give back, whether it is investing in scholarship funds. In Seattle itself, we have found that there's been an increase in homelessness, and a major portion of the homelessness in Seattle, believe it or not, is the fact that kids are being thrown out of their house because of their gender preference. And so there's an area where if we can invest in providing scholarship to give them education and employability, that's where we can have an impact.
Sander, from your perspective, Accenture works in a number of countries. You work in a number of different political regimes and environments, but towards the higher end of the skill scale, I would say. What is your perspective on this, and how do you think, having been instrumental in pushing the agenda here at Davos, what do you think companies like yours, what's your responsibility to make sure things are pushed forward?
Well, let me first say what the concern is, because I'm echoing Susan. I've seen some research after the US elections that 80% of the LGBT people are thinking that things are going to change for the worse. 80% are thinking it's going to be more difficult to come out. And those people, I mean, they're not strangers. They work for Microsoft, they work for Accenture, they work for E&Y, they work for all the companies here in the room, they work for Marriott, and so they are our people. And we need to tell them that we stand with them in this, in this journey. And I would say the LGBT community in Accenture in North America is more, lively and active than ever. So at Accenture, we stand firm by our values. And then when you come to the political environment and the global or the international environment, I must say it is also a matter of navigation. What we do in Accenture is very clear. Non-discrimination, everybody is welcome, everybody should take their whole self to work. There is sort of a limit on one side. We don't want to endanger the lives of our employees. That's sort of where and then within that, I think, we need to stand firm in whatever country we are, that people should bring their whole self to work.
But what is that? Can I just push you a bit more on that? Because that's I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But what does that actually translate into in concrete terms? What does standing behind your employees in this kind of environment mean? And what does it mean to say you obviously don't want to put anybody in danger, but how do you push further, and how do you make sure that this agenda isn't slowed and continues?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, we help people, and most of our LGBT networks, they are started from the bottom up. We help people who take the initiative. I was with a group of our employees in India just a few months ago, and there's a group of 10 people around the table, and they say, we want to start an LGBT network here in India and Accenture, help us. So that's one. The other thing that we're doing in Accenture is we've made a league table of our policies in every country. What policies have we applied, in terms of the benefits, I think that's an important one, in terms of do we have a network, et cetera, et cetera. So we're bringing out the real state of the nation in Accenture of every country. We're bringing out as a benchmark, we're bringing that to the surface. And then finally, we have the dialogue with our local leaders in all of our countries. Because our local leaders are not always the most supportive folks also. And that's okay, because that's where they come from. So we need to help them as well. And now ultimately, we stand firm with them and say, we are supportive of the LGBT agenda. You should be supportive of the LGBT agenda. And if you're not, then we need to have another conversation. So that's sort of the three levels that we operate at.
Susan, did you want to add something to that?
I think it's really important what Sandra's mentioned in terms of the employee network group. We find that providing that support country by country and to create that network of connections across the country has been really critical. And I think the training in terms of making sure our managers and our leaders have the right level of training to be celebrating differences of all kinds, all communities, and ensuring that we uphold as role models that we have great leadership at a local level as well, it's become even more important than ever.
How do you go, and that's impressively clearly laid out exactly what you're doing, but it brings me to a slightly tougher question perhaps, which is, we talk in terms of inclusivity, which is a huge step forward, but a discussion earlier on one of the tables this morning said, what is it that gets you from inclusivity to belonging, which is another step forward. A sense of belonging is, so you can tick boxes on inclusivity, you can act on inclusivity, that's really, really important. Gosh, it's a step forward. But how do you get beyond that to this concept of belonging? Zaid, let's start with you.
It is an excellent question because it suggests something very emotional. And it requires leadership. It requires setting a good example, as the leadership of a particular company needs to do. The board needs to support. The shareholders need to be supportive as well. The clients, the customer base needs to appreciate what this means. And the power of the corporate world needs to be brought to the fore, because governments can't do it alone when they themselves are being rocked by the changes in the electoral cycles. We are putting out a guidance note based on the guidelines we have, the guiding principles for business and human rights. We've been working on this for the last 6 months. We've launched, a few years ago, we launched the Free and Equal campaign, which we believe has reached billions of people. And we ask companies to log on to our website, the Free and Equal website, and this can be helpful. At the core of it, we need to get to the CEOs of companies, and we need for them to see and witness the leadership that other companies have taken on this issue, and encourage them, if they're still to take those steps, decisively.
Ken, I wanted to get your perspective on this. You, at Human Rights Watch, you have the very important task of holding people to account. In some sense, you're often the bearers of bad news. You tell us where governments are not living up to what they are supposed to live up to. So in answering this question of how do we get from inclusivity to belonging, point me to the places that you're most worried about. Where should we, over the next year, really be concerned about?
Well, it's interesting. If you look around the world, there's this false assumption that, the West is the bastion of progressivity on these issues, and the global South is all regressive. Now, that's just not true. If you look today at, where is some of the strongest leadership coming from on LGBT rights issues, it's Latin America. There has been despite this being a Catholic traditional region, Latin America has moved, miles, kilometers in recent years. And so at the international level, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, Colombia are playing leadership roles. They've helped get a special rapporteur on LGBT rights appointed by the UN. They've helped get endorsement of principles against discrimination and violence against gays. So, that's interesting, and it forces you to re-examine. I mean, even in Africa, you wouldn't know it, but, Mozambique, Botswana were places where we had progress this year. Even Kenya, which has been a real battleground, Kenyatta came out against violence against gays. So I think you've got to, there's this tendency to view LGBT rights issues as somehow imposed from the West. I sometimes have this image, where they think that there's this, Western helicopter running around, airdropping gays into countries, and it's important to fight back to show that every country in the world has diversity with respect to gender identity and sexual orientation, and that the job of the West is to enable this natural existence to flourish and to fight against conservative forces that resist it. Now, this happened very well in Uganda, which has been, one of the real battlegrounds. Museveni, adopted this awful anti-homosexuality bill, this draconian bill. There was then enormous pressure put on him by the business community. Virgin was a good example of a country that really came forward. And so the Constitutional Court kind of conveniently found a procedural problem in the way the law was enacted. And Museveni said, well, maybe it's not a good idea to pursue this again. So it shows that, even in countries that in this case are informed by a kind of evangelical point of view, Museveni's wife is notorious for playing a role in this regard, that pressure from business can be very important.
Is that also the case in Latin America, or has that been a broader social change? How much of a role has business played there?
I mean, business I was just in Brazil and spoke to, actually a room full of, self-identified LGBT people and it was a corporate group, and it was, I think it's been very much bottom up there. But governments have been, played important leadership roles in that regard. And so we are pushing on open doors. And at this point, I view Latin America as one of the real bastions of LGBT rights. If we look around the world and say, where are our allies? I mean, yes, of course we look to North America and Western Europe, but we look to Latin America as well. And they become incredibly reliable allies because the population has changed and public views evolve over time. And in this case, it's not the North, it's the global South.
That's fascinating and incredibly heartening. And Susan, does that translate into you perhaps thinking differently about how you approach building global coalitions on the business side?
Yeah, no, I think you make a really important point. As we think about our employees and ensuring that we look at human rights. I was actually sharing this, that as we look at acquisitions, we actually do human rights assessment as part of the due diligence at the beginning versus after the fact. And so that has actually influenced our decisions in terms of where we make investments. And that has become an important part of our culture. The second comment I would make is our CEO, every time he speaks with employees, it is a topic that he includes in his discussion every single time. And as a role model, it absolutely filters down. You start seeing every leader also including that and having that open dialogue. And then the third point is around how, as a technology company, we've laid out a very exciting vision for the future as it relates to transformation. But along with it, we've also laid out a framework in terms of what policies need to be in place. And it can't be just this incredible innovation. It's how do we have a societal impact, and making sure that there's those framework that come together, and also taking an active role in policy. The person I report to, Brad Smith, has been very vocal and has been very engaged in policy reform and standing up on behalf of our employees, and is also making it a business imperative.
And Sander, have you been thinking, because there is now progress in places, as Ken says, where it's no longer just Northern Europe and North America, that the international, let's say the Davos coalition should be broadened to companies actually that are from the Latin American companies from other parts of the emerging world? Is that something that's sort of on your agenda?
No, well, absolutely. It's on our agenda as Accenture, but I'm also a board member at Out and Equal, which is a US-based organization that has worked with numerous corporations in the US. We've just had our first big event in Brazil with the usual suspects from the international community, but also a whole bunch of local companies. Same thing has happened in Japan. So let's say I think there's a role for international companies to play to, take the message out and then bring the local companies, who are often our clients, business partners, or we are related to them in another way, to bring them along.
And how do you, having done some of this, how do you recommend companies in this room, companies here at the World Economic Forum, think about doing that? I mean, are there some tips you've got for how to push this? Because this is really striking that you have this. I was moderating a panel here a year ago, and this was not a topic of conversation. It was very much a international company-led approach, and so I think there's a huge opportunity here.
Well, it's a matter of reaching out. Human Rights Watch has played a big role in Japan in setting up all this. It's just a matter of the personal connection with the local companies. Just ask them. And if we have these events, and it even has happened today, we always have people raising their hands saying, next year we also want to participate. And that's sort of, we need that groundswell to continue.
Yeah, I should say these kind of events are important because the world is evolving. I mean, Sandra mentions Japan. I was in Japan earlier in the year, or last year, I guess, and we had just put out a report on bullying of LGBT high school students. And so I was meeting with the relevant education minister, and they have this wonderful anti-bullying curriculum, but they don't mention gays. It's just generic. And so I said, well, why don't we talk about LGBT kids? And well, we don't know we can do that, And it's just, and you kind of run into this conservatism. And it is important for, companies and really anybody to nudge, because the world is evolving. And I'm convinced that we're going to have, an explicit anti-LGBT bullying policy in Japan before long, but we just kind of nudge them in the right direction. We have to build up comfort. And they know that that's the right thing to do, but it's just a little bit too difficult right now. And so that's where progress can be made.
Yes, go ahead.
I was going to add, one of the other focus areas is we have obviously a code of conduct for ourselves, but we have tremendous numbers of suppliers. And so we have enforced our supplier code of conduct as well. And that also is helping us to, in some ways, to take our strong beliefs again, anti-discrimination, but also expand it into our huge, large number of suppliers, and use it as an opportunity also to bring them together, to educate them as to why it's important. And hopefully there we're providing sort of almost a multiplier effect.
You've mentioned a lot of initiatives that you are taking, which are terrific, concrete ones. We're about to run out of time, but what I wanted to do to end was to put all four of you on the spot. And on the assumption that there will be another event like this next year that will also be joined by friends and supporters on Facebook, I'd like you to say what you hope to achieve in the next year. What should this movement try and achieve in the next year concretely, so we can hold you to account at the end of the next year?
I would like to have a big CEO of a big company on this panel next year. That would be my objective.
That's a very concrete one. We can certainly check whether that's happened or not.
Mine is a bit more grassroots. The good news behind the backlash is that there is a stronger LGBT rights community around the world. Activists, but just people leading their lives. It is much more visible, and therefore you're getting a reaction. And it's led by social conservatives. The evangelicals are playing a particularly nefarious role in many countries. And what I want to do is to mount a strong defense and fight back. I know that this is going to be a tough year, but I want to maintain the progress and continue the progress.
Where is it going to be toughest? We've talked a lot about the good things that are happening. Just briefly before I get to the other two of you, where do we need to worry about most?
Well, I worry about, I talked about Putin earlier, and he epitomizes the use of traditional values, which often just means anti-gay, to rally political support. And it's no surprise that this happens in countries that are facing economic decline and all kinds of problems. Blame the gays, change the subject. And so we have to kind of be aware of the populists who are pursuing a separate agenda, find it convenient to gay bash. And that is a dangerous force which we have to fight back against.
So another reason to worry about Vladimir Putin. Susan, what's the concrete thing you're going to do in the next year that we can hold you to account for?
I'd like to see us advance in countries where it has been a challenge, and see us actually be able to come back and report back that we've made progress in certain countries that may not necessarily have the same principles as a Microsoft in terms of a private sector.
Any particular countries?
We have a few, I think, that I would add. I think we're all very aware of those, but it really is about making sure that our employees feel safe, that they can bring their best self, that they can actually contribute, and we know that it is a business driver. We see tremendous business results when we have inclusive environments where people feel safe, comfortable to be who they are.
Saeed, the last word is yours. What's the concrete thing you should have achieved by this time next year?
Well, even within the context of the UN, there's this attitude that every cause needs champions, and indeed it does, and certainly this cause has had outstanding champions. And the challenge is to make champions of everyone. In the UN, for instance, they say we leave it to the human rights people to make the argument. In actual fact, we need everyone to make the argument. We need UNICEF to make the argument. We need UN Women to make the argument. We need all parts of the UN to support. And so, yes, we're prepared to take a leadership role. And that should be reflected not just in countries, but it should be reflected also in the private corporate world. That we have to make, it is, as Ken says, it is perilous out there. And that we have to hang together, and we have to make champions of each individual, empower them to go out and speak. No voice is too small, and no brain is without enough brain power to change this landscape, and that's what we have to encourage.
No voice is too small. That is a perfect note to end on. Thank you all very much, and thank you on Facebook for watching.